Welcome, everybody. I'm Jonathan Marashli, and I'm joined today by my two good friends in the telecom ecosystem, Ryan Guthrie and David Rubenstein. We'll get to them in just a second. Just wanted to tee up today our webinar presentation, which is a end of year or final quarter update on where things stand with the Universal Service Fund program, kind of giving you an update on things that have changed over the course of the past couple of years since the last time we got this group together to talk about the program and how our firms can assist clients. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, I'm joined with myself, Jonathan Marashli, and I am the managing partner of Marashli and Donahue, the Comm Law Group, a firm that specializes in representation of communication service providers. One of the areas of our expertise just so happens to be communications taxes and regulatory fees. And the big one of all is the Universal Service Fund. Everybody is quite familiar with the USF. I'm also the founder of the Compliance Group, which is our firm's affiliated outsourced compliance firm. Does consulting and fixed fee subscription-based outsourced compliance for your tax, regulatory, and even corporate needs. Joined again by Ryan Guthrie. Ryan is with Advanced Technologies and Services, Inc. Their website is www.atso.com. I always refer to them as ATSO and not ATSI, but they are ATSI. And Ryan's firm specializes in one aspect of the work that David and I do for our clients, which is traffic studies and helping companies that have a USF compliance obligation minimize their exposure. And we'll be getting into that in quite a bit of detail later on. Last but not least, David Rubenstein with CCH SureTax, a Wolters Kluwer company. And David is just the best of the best when it comes to knowing the content. His company is a tax engine provider, one of the very best in the marketplace and most sophisticated engines with some of the best content. So again, David is an expert at all things tax engine related. And he, I think, leads the professional services practice over at CCH SureTax. So without further ado, we'll jump right into it. But I guess there is a little ado as a lawyer. Just want to make sure that post the legal disclaimer, I'm not going to go through it in detail. It's a lot of legalese. Just understand that simply by participating, listening to this webinar does not create an attorney-client relationship. And anything that you hear on this webinar is informational only. Consult with the professionals before you do anything in reliance on the information shared today. Next up, the agenda. All right, everybody, so this is what we're going to do today. Let me go through the agenda. First, I'm going to go through a quick update on the state of the USF. Where do things stand? How did we get here? Is it still volatile? Is it stable? Then I'm going to move on to some practical guidance on how your Form 499 revenue reporting is really driving dollars and cents. And in that process, you have a number of levers that you can control, things like your unbundling, your revenue allocations, the utilization of traffic studies. All of these things can be used to minimize your exposure of revenue to the huge USF fee factor. Again, this is why you have to spend money to save, and that's the right mindset that you should have in a high contribution factor environment like the one we have and will continue to have for the foreseeable future. I'll discuss what has changed since the Supreme Court came out with its June decision preserving the constitutionality or establishing the constitutionality of the USF program as it's been constituted for the past 30 years. My goal here is really simple, is to leave everybody with some clear action items that improve your compliance and competitiveness starting this quarter. So again, I'll just try to set the tone. In a world where the contribution factor has been living in the mid to high 30s, and as I'll get to, it's currently 38.1% as of October 1st through the remainder of the year. In that world, you know, your cost controls aren't just about cutting corners. It's really about investing and being precise with how you are calculating your USF assessments and how much you're billing your customers, how much you're reporting to USEC, and how much you're remitting. The companies that are winning in this environment have made relatively modest, very targeted investments in improving their product and services catalogs, getting them mapped into tax engines like SureTax to produce accurate results that align with how they've unbundled bundles, how they've taken advantage of traffic studies to minimize the interstate component. And these companies are the ones that are no longer subsidizing their competitors. They're the ones that are being subsidized by companies that have not yet optimized their product and services catalogs. Next slide. So what is the state of the USF? It's on the verge of collapse, but to be quite honest, it's here to stay. The Supreme Court, as I'll get to shortly, did uphold the constitutionality of the program and the way the FCC has delegated to USAC to administer the program. So as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, everything is kosher, and it's going to be with us. Now, that does not deny the fact that the program continues to be under extreme pressure. The contribution eligible revenue base continues to shrink rapidly. So even after this past June's ruling by the Supreme Court, the machinery run by USAC continues unabated, unchanged from the years prior to the Supreme Court challenge. So at the end of the day, what I try to tell clients is you can't wait for reform to rescue your P&L statement. The smart move right now is to operate within the rules as written and squeeze every compliant efficiency out of your reporting, your packaging of services and products and bundles, and your cost recovery mechanism and strategy. Next slide. So again, the program, right? It's teetering on the brink of collapse, but it's not going to collapse because it can't collapse. It's statutorily required. USAC is going to continue to squeeze out every drop it can from the dwindling revenue base that qualifies for contributions. That ultimately keeps going down while the fee factor keeps going up because the outflows from the USF program are relatively steady, holding steady around $9 billion a year. But in order to fund that $9 billion outflow, the fee factor as of October 1st through the end of this year is going to be 38.1%. And that is at an all-time historic high. Volatility in the fee factor is the norm these days. But again, as far as USAC and the industry is concerned, USF program, even after the Supreme Court decision, remains unchanged. The best thing that you have, at your disposal is learning some of the tips that we're going to be sharing with you in today's presentation. Let me just jump to the next slide, Ryan. We'll get into, So why does the Supreme Court decision, how did we get there? So the case was Consumers Research versus the FCC. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals had sided with Consumers Research, which challenged the constitutionality of the program. It was taken up to the Supreme Court, which decided on June 27th of this year, reversing the Fifth Circuit, leaving the Universal Service Fund framework in place. The Supreme Court said that Congress had given enough guidance to the FCC to create the program, and the FCC had the authority to delegate the administration of the program to USAC. But what the court didn't decide is another constitutional question, which is called the major questions doctrine. So there's still an opportunity for possible challenge to the constitutionality of the program, but again, we are light years away from that matriculating to the Supreme Court again. And by then, as I'll get to shortly, we'll likely see some reforms happening at Congress. So next slide. So, the FCC and the Fifth Circuit, after the Supreme Court had rendered its decision, Consumers Research went back to the Fifth Circuit. They tried to narrow some focus of what they were challenging. I don't know if it's completely resolved at the Fifth Circuit, but I don't believe that we are going to get anything out of the lower courts that's going to result in, again, another situation where a case gets teed up to the Supreme Court again. So again, while there are some constitutional issues relative to the FCC's administration of the program and its oversight of the program and USAC's administration, those questions are not likely to arise in the judicial context prior to some action being taken by Congress. Next slide. So what does this mean for you, right? With some challenges still meandering through the courts, with consumers research still objecting each quarter to the commission's announcement of the quarterly fee factor, where does it leave you? It basically leaves you the same place you were before. You have to report revenue in your 499s. You have to optimize. You have to deal with the fact that you've got a rising contribution factor, and you have to be audit ready. So if your revenue reporting is questioned by USAC through either a formal audit or through an issue notice that happens regularly, either during the quarterly submissions or annually, you need to have the books and records to support your positions with respect to how you're reporting your revenue, and that includes how you're allocating revenue to the interstate jurisdiction for assessment. Next slide. So where do we go from here? I keep on referencing Congress. So prior to the Supreme Court hearing the Consumers Research case last year and then deciding it in June of this year, there was a fairly active working group set up by Congress, a bipartisan group that was looking into reform initiatives. One of the big ideas on the table was to broaden the base of contributions to possibly include broadband revenues and revenue from large edge providers. That conversation is perpetuating. That working group was reinvigorated after the Supreme Court decision. They have been active. They've taken comments from the public. Other ideas that have been tossed around in Congress are potentially using auction proceeds to, wireless license auction proceeds to fund USF outflows. Another one is direct appropriations, just taking it from the general tax fund. Every year that would have to be approved. So not a lot of certainty and confidence that would happen. So again, where I think we're reading the tea leaves would be this USF working group coming up with some compromise solution at some point in time that can get through both houses of Congress and be signed by the president. When will that happen? I would say that it's anybody's guess, but we do know that just this past month, maybe it was August or early September, the USF working group in Congress solicited public comments. So they're building a record, and I know a number of parties did submit comments with a lot of the weight being in the direction of add broadband revenue to the contribution base. Let's just fix the program as it exists. Let's tighten up some things, and let's broaden the base of contributions so that the revenue goes up and that contribution fee factor gets dropped down from 38% to, who knows? Some studies have indicated that you can get that down to 3 or 4% or even lower. But until then, and this is, I'll go ahead and I think handing off to next slide, Ryan. Yeah. Bottom line is we're at a point in time where Congress moves at a snail's pace, number one. Number two, it's even slower in today's political environment where, there's probably less appetite to come up with something that taps into more revenue or something that looks more like a tax. But this is squarely in Congress's hands. The last we heard from the FCC was a few years ago when they punted on the issue. They had an opportunity to report to Congress. In their report to Congress, they had an opportunity to come up with some reform measures, and they just completely punted. So this is, squarely in Congress's hands. And Congress might come to save you, but they're not coming quick. And every month in telecom industry, as everybody knows, is a lifetime. When your competitors are charging 20% less than you when you add up all of the taxes and surcharges, you have to be competitive. So, the only way to do that is to save yourself. And the rest of this conversation, I think, will be geared towards guiding you to what you can do to improve your competitive positioning and do so lawfully. Next slide. The key, from my perspective, is unbundling and revenue allocations. And we'll get into the details of how we do that. But bottom line is, what's a bundle? Well, a bundle is any single retail service item that actually is comprised of multiple subparts or components or elements. So the big dividing line that I always like to highlight is you can have a retail service that has one part telecommunications or voice over IP, and another part might be information service or software or SaaS, something that is not telecom. So that's one way to highlight starkly the difference between, or what you can do with a bundle. So if I'm selling a bundled service for $10, but I can support cost allocations and other books and records evidence for minimizing a component of that bundle and isolating the communications component, let's say it's 50-50. Well, now you've reduced by a factor of 2, 50% less your exposure of revenue to the Universal Service Fund and other regulatory program fees. So that's a simple definition of bundle. Okay. What is a geographic allocation? Ryan's going to speak to you about geographic allocations because that's where things like the safe harbors, if you're voice over IP or wireless, you've got 2 safe harbors that you can default to. Again, they tend to lean, at least the voice over IP leans very heavily in favor of the FCC and USAC and increased contributions, a 64.9% interstate allocation. I think, again, industry average for voice over IP is somewhere closer to 25, 30, somewhere in that range. So again, you can see that through the use of a traffic study, if the facts support it, you can reduce your exposure of revenue to the USF even further by using a traffic study to reduce that safe harbor down to something more rational and reasonable and supported by the facts. So with that, I'm going to hand the baton over to Ryan, and he'll talk to you a little bit about what ATSO, I told you I would do it again, what ATSI can do to help you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So as Jonathan was saying, Safe Harbor was established almost 20 years ago at this point. And for when they came up with the Safe Harbor rates, they determined that VoIP would be 64.9% and wireless would be 37.1%. And what that essentially is the default rates of international or interstate usage that you have to use for your filing if you don't do your own traffic study or books and records study. And when they did that back in 2006, they even admitted at that point that it could be even higher than that. They said, we're kind of giving you a gift of only setting it at 64.9. We probably could make it higher. And if you remember back 20 years ago, voice over IP may have been or was used more for interstate and international as kind of a cheaper way to make those types of calls. But obviously over the past 20 years, that's changed drastically. And that's practically what everybody uses now for their home calling, their business calling, and everything else. So that's why, as Jonathan was saying, when we do these traffic studies and when you look at your traffic, we never see it at 64.9%. Knock on wood, in all the traffic studies we've seen, we've never seen it at or anywhere close to safe harbors. Typically, it's about half, maybe 30%, 25 to 30, as Jonathan was saying. When it comes to the wireless revenue, that is still a high rate. We do see it less than that. It could be a little higher than voice over IP, the way people use their cell phones, but we've never seen it at or above safe harbor when it comes to wireless either. So safe harbor is not your friend. It's expensive. If you're using safe harbor, you're definitely paying more. Now, when it comes to most providers, it's a pass-through, right? It ends up on the customer's bill. So as Jonathan was saying, if you're using safe harbor and not doing your own traffic study, you're increasing your customer's bills. And when it comes to the competitive nature as it is today, that's going to be a big difference, right? If you're padding those bills every quarter as these rates go up, your bill's going higher, customers are going to call in, they're not going to be happy. The best way to reduce that is by doing a traffic study, and you'll reduce your USF by probably half by doing that traffic study. And if you're not passing it through to your customer, then it really is just true savings. Then you're just paying more than you need to, and you can pocket all that. But I'd say most of the companies we talk with are using it as a pass-through cost in their customer's bill. So what exactly are we talking about as far as savings? So we'll look at these two companies here, or one company, both with with the same $1 million revenue, assessable revenue. And as Jonathan was talking about, there's some ways to adjust that assessable revenue by doing unbundling and things like that. But on the left, the company is using safe harbor, 64.9%. Contribution factor in third quarter was 36. It's actually higher now. So it'd be 38.1. So these numbers would be even a little bit higher. But at $1 million of accessible revenue and a 64.9% safe harbor and a contribution factor of 36%, your total contribution is going to be $233,000. Now take that same company and do a traffic study and find that your actual percent of interstate or international usage is only 27%. Keep that same contribution factor of 36, which again went up. And now your total contribution is only $97,000, right? Again, less than half of that. And that makes a big difference when you're passing it through to your customer's bill. So it's another way, or the best way, to reduce those rates and reduce your customers' bills when it comes to your taxes. So Jonathan talked a little bit about books and records and traffic study. They're similar but different, right? So when we do a traffic study, we actually perform it in two different ways. We take all the traffic and we take a statistical sampling of it. And then we actually look at all the traffic in its total and run the analysis both ways. And what we typically find is that those numbers are exactly the same. So it's really just proving the fact that if you do statistical or full data sample, you're going to end up with the same result. But again, when Safe Harbor first started 20 years ago, doing a full traffic study on every single CDR for a large company, even a medium company, was pretty difficult because the tools just weren't there, right? The ability to store that data, to process that data, it was very difficult. I remember the way we did studies 20 years ago was very different than how we do today. We had to spin up Hadoop clusters sometimes and do some really interesting things to get through all that traffic. And now it's something that you can spin up and run very quickly through. But that's why that books and records and statistical sampling versus a full traffic study got put in place. But Jonathan can talk a little more about the differences between those two.
Yeah, I think, Ryan, you hit the nail on the head with respect to the big difference is the FCC in its rules recognizes three different ways of geographically dividing revenue between interstate and intrastate jurisdiction. The one is safe harbor. That's the easy one. They love it. It's very favorable to the FCC, USAC, and the program. Not good for the industry or to the customers that are being served. The other option is the traffic study, and the traffic study in the rules contemplates the statistical sampling. And again, the rules haven't changed in 25 years relative to that language in the rules and in the instructions. So, as you just mentioned, the cost and the process of doing a full CDR analysis used to be extremely high and burdensome, which is what gave rise to the reason the FCC came out with studies, sampling. The third option is the books and records, and that would basically be, CDR record by CDR record, connecting the dots between called party and calling party to determine the jurisdictional breakout. The big difference, I would say, in the books and records approach and the traffic study is in particular when you have a traffic study done by an independent third party like ATSI, they are, again, practically unassailable is what I say. I don't want to overstate the fact, but when you have an independent third party doing the analysis, and again, whether it's the full CDR analysis plus the statistical sampling all shrouded in, the independent third party report, it's a waste of USAC's time to investigate and dig too deeply into it. And by and large, they are accepted and we move on. Whereas companies that rely on either an internal traffic study or internally conducted CDR analyses tend to have those looked at quite closely by USAC. So in my practical experience with hundreds of companies over the years, I would say that by and large, anytime we are getting a review or an audit and a company has been relying on their quote unquote books and records, it is a much more challenging defense. And you can save yourself a lot of time and money and effort if you just undertake the annual traffic studies through an independent third party.
Right. Thanks. And that's a good point. I meant to mention that as well, as far as how often to do it. So, again, back 20 years ago, when they first gave you the capability of doing traffic studies, there were some set of rules about statistical sampling and how much data to use and that kind of stuff, but it was pretty broad, or wasn't really defined at all as far as how often you have to do it or anything like that. Now they do have those quarterly webinars, and in those they verbally say, we'd like you to use roughly this amount of data at a minimum, or we'd like you to do it this often. And none of that is written down in the rules, but they've given us some guidelines as far as what they're expecting and what they want to see and what they don't want to see. So when we do the traffic studies, at a minimum, we'll look at least 1 quarter's worth of traffic details, and sometimes up to a full year. And that depends on the company and how much they hold and that kind of stuff. But at a minimum, we look at a quarter in order to have a valid statistical sample for that. And then as far as how often to redo the study, we recommend, and I know Jonathan recommends, redoing that once per year. We have some customers that'll go to 2 years, and that's okay. It's been accepted so far. We haven't had anybody question that, but USAC has said in their quarterly webinars, if you start to go beyond that, they may start to take a little closer look at it, because your traffic could certainly change over that time frame and might not be accurate anymore. So we certainly always recommend once a year as a good baseline for redoing a traffic study. This here is just an example of one of the statistical sampling that we look at and how we break it out. We look at it a few different ways by day of week. We break it into 7-day periods, different ways to kind of slice and dice the data. But ultimately, what we end up proving is that by looking at our statistical sampling and by looking at the full set of call records, we ultimately come up to the same conclusion that the PIU is much lower than safe harbor. Again, usually about half. As far as those traffic study options, there are a few different things you can do. Again, Jonathan has been touched on this. You can decide to do it in-house. And again, because those tools are more readily available, there are certainly ways to do it in-house now. But when you do your own traffic study, it does open it up to a little more scrutiny, because you're doing it internally instead of by an independent third party. Doesn't make it any less valid, just makes it potentially, USAC might take a little closer look at it just because it's done in-house instead of by an independent third party. But doesn't mean it's a wrong way to do it. Again, just depends on your preference. But we would obviously recommend use an outside vendor. We've been doing these studies for, again, almost 20 years. We've done hundreds of them. Knock on wood, we've never had a single one get audited. And again, we've never had a single one come anywhere close to safe harbor. We turn these things around pretty quickly. Once we get your data, it's usually a couple weeks to actually get your traffic study back to you. And essentially what we provide is a PDF of the report that shows exactly what we did, exactly what you sent us, the methods that we used, and ultimately what your PIU for that time period should be. And you staple that report along with your 499 filing and submit that and use that instead of safe harbor. As far as time of year to do that, now's the time. So you can actually adjust to traffic study anytime during the year, but leading up to your November 499 filing, which is projecting your 26 revenue, is really a good time to do it, because it's a nice clean cut from your 25 to 26 filings, where you can then project out for the full year using that new PIU. So if you're looking for when should you do it, now's the prime time. You can certainly do it anytime during the year, but now would certainly be ideal. Jonathan, I'll pass the card back to you.
Yeah, and again, I think this slide speaks for itself, right? Why use an independent third party like ATS to do a traffic study? The key is to be competitive, right? Ryan's been hammering that point home, that if you're not doing a traffic study, if you're not allocating based on your actual utilization of interstate and intrastate, you are good chance you're spending more and your customers are having to pay more in contributions than your competitors. It also helps to be compliant, right? It's that long track record of success that Ryan mentioned, and again, we'll knock on wood, but even knocking on wood, at the end of the day, the way they do their traffic studies is sound. It's supported by the data. All the data is going to be there and available, produced by a third party if ever audited, you know. So again, another good reason to consider a independent third party traffic study. And the last one is the intersection of privacy laws and document retention rules. So for companies, I've experienced this in my practice. Companies don't want to hold on to their customers' confidential information, and CDR records are CP&I, customer proprietary network information. They don't want to hang on to that information for longer than they have to. Of course, in order to support your revenue reporting, you have to have up to 5 years worth of records to defend your USAC 499 revenue reporting. So on the one hand, you have to have your CP&I, those CDRs, for 5 years, no less than 5 years. On the other hand, you've got these increased pressures from the state privacy laws and even international to minimize how long your company is holding on to this data. And there's an economic pressure too, right? Storing all that data, it's huge volumes of data, it can be costly. So shift that burden of maintaining that data to a third party like ATS, okay? You shift it off of your desk and put it onto theirs. You're no longer in possession and control of it. ATS is. They're doing so by contract and complying with the CP&I regulations in doing so. And it allows you to maintain healthier practices internally. All right, so as I was just summarizing, probably going into too many details with my summary, as I tend to do. To be competitive, you need to be optimized. So with that USF fee factor being as high as it is, and with the geographic allocation that you can achieve through a traffic study, and getting as much as 50% or more lower based off of your actual data, that's the best way to go. And then you implement it through your product catalog. Get that through SureTax mapped into the engine so that you're billing your customers based on a much lower rate. We tend to, at our organization, work with clients through a detailed step-by-step, very thoughtful process where we're not just looking at the geographic allocation, we're also looking at other ways to unbundle bundled services. The key ones being, let's segregate out the telecom or the accessible component of a bundle from those elements of a bundle that are not accessible by law. And you can visit our website and download a brochure that talks you through that process, a 4-step process that ultimately leads to, a safer 5th step, which is outsourcing your compliance. Next slide. Number 2, again, why we support using an independent third-party traffic study. They're easier to defend. They've been successful. They're highly reliable. So, Ryan's already gotten into a bunch of these things. We've already covered a lot of these, the value add of using ATS in particular. So we won't dwell on those. We'll just move on to the next slide. And again, in my summary, I covered quite a bit of the intersection of privacy law and FCC record keeping rules. And once again, another key benefit of working with an independent third party like ATS to maintain your information so you don't have to. And with that, I guess we will pass it over to our good friend David. Carry us home.
Thank you, Jonathan. So traffic studies are great. They definitely help to bring down that FUSF burden on you and your customers. But there's an even better way, perhaps, to approach the FUSF management, and that's with unbundling. As Jonathan explained earlier, there's typically VoIP providers are selling their products in a package, and that package has both accessible elements for the Federal Universal Service Fund as well as non-accessible elements. In fact, the non-accessible elements will typically exceed once the telecom accessible components once we peel back the onion, and there's a reason for that. The non-accessible elements include not only things that are like software, as we discussed, as has been touched on, and other elements, support and whatnot. Even the telecommunications itself can have both accessible telecom and unaccessible telecom, meaning there's things which are ancillary or peripheral or adjunct to the telecom service, which will be considered for FCC purposes to be information service. For example, if you have a hunt group or any of these kind of software type services which are supporting a telecom can be segregated out. We don't necessarily recommend that you take a whack at it, yourself, but certainly under guidance of a professional like Jonathan and his team, and others who are experienced at this, they can assist you to peel back the onion in your package and significantly bring down the non-accessible percentage, so that Ryan suggested earlier that your traffic study can typically bring down your accessible FUSF by half by having a PAU switch from interstate to interstate, and we think that you can do even better on that with proper and successful unbundling.
Yeah, David, and before you move on, I'll just add an interesting note to your comment about not trying to do this yourself. And here's that note. If you try to do it yourself and you fail and you get audited or you have a review by USAC and they determine that you couldn't support the allocation that you came up with, they're not going to say, oh, come back and have another bite at the apple. They're going to default you back to the safe harbor. They're going to default you to 100% accessible telecom. USAC's approach is not necessarily to work with you. So if you can't support what you've done in how you've reported, they're going to make it as painful as possible. And then you're going to find yourself having to appeal to the FCC, waiting forever to get a decision. And all the while, you'll be confronted with invoices on 100% telecom accessible with the safe harbor. So again, just practical knowledge goes, very important to understand the consequences of not approaching this process with a great degree of care. So don't just monkey see, monkey do and say, oh, it looks like my competitor's doing a 50-50. Well, if you can't support 50-50, you're not going to get 60-40. You're going to be hit with 100%. So be mindful of that. So back to you, David.
Yeah, very good point, John. We've seen sometimes looking at catalogs and bundle allocations where customers seemingly randomly decided that everything that they sell is going to become a bundle, whether it's truly a bundle or not. Which is the first question, is it truly a bundle? And then they're taking things like something out in their head that support would be nice at 40%, and all of a sudden the entire catalog's being unbundled at 40% support. So the question is, can they substantiate that, right? Someone asks them, how'd you get that number? They can't support it. They're going to be a very wrong side of the audit.
Yeah. And you can be helpful in kind of pointing out to the companies that you're working with that, looks a little tough, a little aggressive there, but you're not the attorney. You're not hired to be their attorney. At the end of the day, they're going to suffer the consequences of whatever decision they make. I won't speak for you, David, but your role is get them onboarded, get them implemented so that they can start applying their policies to their billing practices. And, again, I'll let you speak for yourself, but you're not supposed to be their lawyer, and you're not.
Of course. So there are some kind of standards when you want to use best practices. Well, we're actually moving on here because we're going to move. And certainly, these things that we just talked about, Jonathan, you mentioned, are true in bundling and also true in cost recovery. And how does this whole discussion of cost recovery play into what we just talked about bundling? Well, it definitely one leads into the other, because at the end of the day, when you bring down that part of the invoice, part of your bill for taxes, fees, surcharges, there's also something we call other. And that other would be potentially a cost recovery. So kind of all is going to be lumped together when you're doing it right. We have truth in billing, which we'll touch on. When you bring down that tax portion of your bill, actually surcharge portion of your bill, by bringing down the FUSF, by managing it correctly, by doing a traffic study, you're going to have significantly bring that by half the burden. So let's say on $100 at 38 1%, you're going to come down from maybe $24 and change to half or even a little bit less. At the same time, that presents an opportunity. And the opportunity is that you can have a carefully, craftily, lawfully designed cost recovery fee, which if you time this at the same time as you're doing your traffic study, if you haven't been doing a cost recovery, it's an opportunity to bring up that portion of your bill and being seamless. Now, how seamless will it be depends how much we're rolling into this. If we roll in both the traffic study together with unbundling, the traffic study, let's say 50% or more, your unbundling could even be more than that. You have a double reduction of your bundle. That's really going to bring down your FUSF liability tremendously. So again, big opportunity to take a look at the cost recovery fee, but you have to make sure that it's reasonable. These aren't typical, Jonathan, I don't believe these are typically questioned so frequently by USAC, but you never know, right? And especially the tier ones definitely do have issues, whether it's from USAC or from class action lawsuits. Right. So whoever's going to question it, you want to make sure that you could back it up.
Yeah, and again, this gets into some fine lines with respect to the FCC's statutory jurisdiction over different types of service providers. On the one hand, if you're interconnected voice over IP, you're not clearly a Title II common carrier like a traditional telecommunications services provider would be. You know, a interconnected VoIP provider, they should be more concerned about state consumer protection laws. They should be more concerned about their own customer coming back and saying, I dispute this charge on my bill. You're telling me that you're recovering a regulatory cost. What are those costs? And as David said, if you're unreasonably charging a recovery fee that you cannot back up with your accounting records that show, here's the revenue I derived from my cost recovery fee. Here are all of the itemized expenses that qualify as a disclosed cost, a regulatory cost, okay? And that's the two sides of the coin. One is the accounting support for what you're recovering, what you're generating, and also it's the disclosure. How are you describing it to your customer? Can that be alleged to be deceptive? As you said, the bigger companies, they might be common carriers, but they're also, truth in billing at the FCC. They're also going to be subject to a lot of those state consumer protection laws. And that's where you've seen some of these class actions in the past challenge their cost recovery fee practices, where the disclosure and the awareness of the customer could not be tightly aligned with the revenue that they're recouping through the surcharge under the auspices of it being regulatory cost recovery in nature. So again, it's more complex concept than we give it credit for, but it's also one that we can work with clients to get through in order to come up with a very reasonable disclosure, a reasonable amount to recover. And again, as long as you're accounting for it and you have the books and records to support your practices, you're going to be in pretty good shape when you either have to defend it before the FCC, states, your own customers, or again, I think, and David, I think you're familiar with them, the telecom expense management consultants, right? The companies, firms that are hired to look at carrier invoices and see abusive practices that they can then lever to get refunds and credits for their customers.
Good point. What other considerations do we have in crafting our cost recovery? Well, you want to make sure that your verbiage corresponds to what you're actually collecting, right? So there's different, mind you, that there's different types of cost recoveries. One type, as we've been discussing, is a regulatory recovery. So you're recovering your costs for different FCC charges, such as the TRS, such as the FRF. There's several different surcharges. These are two higher highest of the rates, but there's several small ones, and they kind of all add up to, let's say, 3-4% potential recovery. There's other costs of being regulatory compliant, such as common law legal fees, such as compliance groups, such as SureTax, such as ATS, any third party you're using for telecom consulting. All these things would fall under you're part of being regulatory compliant. So different ways you can draft the language around the recovery, but you want to make sure that it's broad enough to cover and accurate enough to cover actually what we are collecting.
Yeah, and David, I'll add one more to that. The cost of an in-house person, an individual. So let's say you're a small company and you're the CEO, manager, and you're the CFO, you do everything. Well, if you're paying yourself $100,000 a year and you spend 10% of your year dealing with regulatory matters, well, 10% of your cost to the company could be accounted for as a regulatory expense. So again, working with competent professionals, you can come up with an assortment of ways to defend, justify, and make very clear to your customers, hey, I've got costs to these compliance measures. We're in a regulated industry. We're going to recoup them through these permissible discretionary surcharges. And we're going to do it in an effective way and in a way that we can defend. But at the same time, be competitive with other companies that are out there charging their customers that may not have that backup support. And they would be at great risk as compared to the companies that undertake the effort to design it, implement it, and manage it going forward, because these things are not static. You have to keep an eye on them.
Of course. One important point, cost recoveries that you'll do on your telecom invoice is subject to tax. It's not a freebie. It is a revenue generator. That as such, it's increasing, and it de facto is increasing the cost of the service you're selling. If you're selling a telecom service for $1 and your recovery is, whether it's 5%, 7%, 9%, whatever the number comes out to, that's considered revenue, and it's taxable revenue. It should be associated with the underlying revenue that it's collecting, and if you can't segregate it out into different component parts, then the assumption would be contaminated. We typically see cost recovery taxed as a telecom feature, which would be subject to both FUSF as well as state and local taxes. It doesn't have to be that way. It really depends on how you've crafted it. But just the heads up is we've seen customers get hit on this. SureTax, they come to us, hey, I got getting an audit, what's going on? And then we take a look up at it and then say, hey, you didn't tax your cost recovery, you didn't apply any tax. So of course, you're going to have to pay in the New York gross receipts tax because you didn't subject your cost recovery to this tax, which certainly is assessable. How much can you charge for cost recovery? That's a good question. There are no specific guidelines from the FCC about how much it is, but you want to make sure that it does tie to your cost of compliance, because there's a lot of different factors that Jonathan mentioned before, whether it's state law, whether you are subject under any kind of SCC jurisdiction for it, or whether it's a state law or just a consumer issue. You do want to keep it close to your vest. You don't want to be overly aggressive here. It should make sense. You should be able to defend it. You don't want to really get tied up in legal matter over this, because we've seen as we read the papers, we see various companies have gotten themselves into predicaments when they were played it loosey-goosey with the cost with their cost recovery. So, what kind of options are there? Flat fee per invoice. I'm not recommending that. More typically, you see percentage of services. Again, it should be tying out to, like we said, for books and records, and have like a numerator-denominator effect. Numerator being the actual costs, and then the denominator being the revenues associated with. What is it? What happens after the cost recovery and all this? The traffic study, the unbundling, the cost recovery. Well, you're going to typically be able to FUSF expense management, be able to knock it down by half or more by your traffic study, be able to knock it down by another half or more by your unbundling, hopefully, and then what's your now opportunity, if you haven't been doing a cost recovery, to bring it back up to somewhere in the middle again. But where does that cost recovery go? Straight to your bottom line. So as much as Jonathan was saying, it was encouraging you to make an investment, we're encouraging you to make an investment in order to have a nice return, because the return is, to help, in your bottom line. You don't have to be a tier one to manage this. You can manage this even if you're in that small to medium space, if you have the right professionals that are focusing on this and to assist you. So let us know how we can help.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for your time today. Hopefully you got some valuable information out of it. If you'd like to get in touch with Jonathan or David or myself to ask any questions about traffic studies, unbundling, or any other topics we covered today, all our contact information is right on here. And thanks again. Hope to hear from you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you.